Welcome. My name is Adam Neiman. I'm the artistic director of the Manchester Music Festival, and I will be your host for this episode of Get to Know the Music. Today I will be discussing the concepts of classical and romantic. Of course, these words mean very specific things to very specific people. I will define and debate these words, but also place them within the context of history and music. Let's begin with some music. And now for a very different piece of music. Such lovely works, both of them. I will be revisiting them later on in a musical stylistic analysis. Now let's shift gears to an historical survey that will shed light on the underlying principles behind these varied perspectives. A study of humankind teaches us that societal trends oscillate. Sometimes they revolve by generation. In other cases, they evolve and revolve in much larger scale values of time. In these vast units of time, we can distill an overarching tendency of an age or epoch. Humans have a strong compulsion, for better or for worse, to try to define those tendencies by perspective and tone. It helps them quantify their own existence, to place their existence upon a spectrum of human behavior. As to why socio-historical trends oscillate, I give you the words of T.E. Hone. A particular convention or attitude in art has a strict analogy to the phenomena of organic life. It grows old and decays. It has a definite period of life and must die. All the possible tunes get played on it, and then it is exhausted. One such convention or attitude is the concept of classical. The reference to classical music carries with it an implication or bias. What we mean by this term, classical music, is really twofold. Firstly, we mean to say that this music has withstood the test of time. Like a movie or book can become a classic by virtue of its multi-generational acceptance and reverence, music becomes accepted when it passes the test of time. The second meaning refers to our perception of the Greco-Roman classical period. Later generations that have espoused the principles behind classical philosophy and ethics are then categorized as classical. And what are these classical principles? Here are some quotes that clearly express these classical Greco-Roman perspectives. The most virtuous are those who content themselves with being virtuous without seeking to appear so. Plato. The happiness of your life depends on the quality of your thoughts. Marcus Aurelius. We should every night call ourselves to an account. What infirmity have I mastered today? What passions opposed? What temptation resisted? What virtue acquired? Our vices will abate of themselves if they be brought every day to the shrift. Lucius Annaeus Seneca. Plato's quote refers to that which need not draw attention to itself. Its virtue exists for itself without need of praise or applause. Musically, this translates to unadorned simplicity, a music making without artifice. Aurelius emphasizes the power of the intellect to influence joy. Notice that he doesn't state that passion or love are the causes of joy. No, he says it is the quality of one's thoughts that influence joy. The musical analog is the importance of structure and thoughtfulness in design that cause a work to induce joy in its listener. Seneca focuses on the need to temper passion and temptation so as to transcend vice. The musical analog is a style that favors balance and grace over sentimentality and fury. By contrast, now let us examine some romantic perspectives. Fill your paper with the breathings of your heart. William Wordsworth. Magic is believing in yourself. If you can do that, you can make anything happen. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. William Blake. Wordsworth places high value on feeling, and his quote is a summons to express one's passions, the breathings of one's heart. In music, this would encourage emotion over structure, content over syntax, passion over design. Goethe emphasizes the power of the self. He equates the ability to achieve, quote, anything with the power of self-belief. Note the choice of the word magic. It depicts clearly a world of possibility facilitated by self-worth. Goethe's quote makes me think of Liszt, Paganini, Isai, the power of the virtuosic master, the unaccompanied lone poet who can achieve the seemingly impossible. Think of the word virtuosity. At its root lies virtue, and the hyper-virtuosity of the virtuoso artist would be correlated by the Romantics with spiritual value. Blake expresses the notion that the universe can be perceived in the smallest of minutiae. It is, of course, a call to appreciate the beauty of the world around us, and it emphasizes our potential to connect with the infinite through nature. Blake brings to mind the short works of Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Scriabin, preludes, etudes, impromptus, small-scale works designed to carry the world, the eternal, upon their shoulders. These composers tell us, through their short works, that large structures or frameworks are not vital to the appreciation of beauty, that the infinitesimal can be an equal gateway to God. Classical and Romantic thought do not necessarily conflict or collide in all aspects. The biggest areas of difference reside in the perspectives on passion, temptation, and what constitutes virtue. The classicist emphasizes human existence as finite and part of a larger fabric. The Romantic places the individual at the center of the universe with access to the infinite. Both philosophies clearly value beauty and virtue. They propose accessing them from different perspectives. The period known as the Middle Ages comprise roughly the years 500 to 1300. After the fall of Rome, power became much more regional throughout Europe. In general, the Middle Ages were a period of non-centralized political power, although in the last few centuries of the Middle Ages, power did begin to trend back towards centralization. A good example is modern-day England, which, at the time, was a series of kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, Wessex. In these kingdoms, one would have found a wide mix of languages, some of the native Britannic languages, Anglo-Saxon, which would have been the dominant language, along with Danish, particularly after the Viking raids. The architecture, the dress, and the coinage would reflect regional tastes as well. The early Christian church competed with native and exported pagan religions, and in order to effectively achieve this mission, it developed strong reciprocal ties with regional leaders. In order to widen its reach, the church developed systematically through the endowment of minsters and abbeys, and in turn, they could offer legitimacy to would-be leaders who were often fighting battles of legitimacy. Musically speaking, from what we know, this was a minstrel culture, building upon a long-standing verbal tradition of song, epic poetry, and the imported Norse saga. The instruments used would have been simple, strong instruments, simple flutes, designed to embellish the tale. The content of the music and poetry would have been designed to bring across principles of chivalry, great regional victories, and would sometimes employ the use of legend. The age known as the Renaissance comprises the years roughly between 1300 and the beginning of the 18th century. The Renaissance is so named because it was a period of rebirth, a rebirth of classical principles emanating from ancient Greece and Rome. And during the Renaissance, we see the further centralization of political power bases. For example, in Europe, England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Portugal. Among these countries, there would have been tremendous cross-pollination, not only of language and customs, but marriage. The intermarriage among the courts would have fostered international travel, ambassadorships, and in general, a more sophisticated exchange of cultural ideas. Of note during the Renaissance is the establishment of Protestantism in England and Germany. This was significant for a number of reasons. There's the break with the papacy in Rome, on one hand. There's the fact that the Bible was translated into the common tongue in both regions. And there was the re-systemization of the church to a more regional power base. Another item of significance during the Renaissance was the invention of the Gutenberg press, which allowed for the establishment of a written tradition in art and literature. You can imagine the increase possible in the complexity of written music. And during this period, we see the rise of polyphony. Polyphony means many voices. Composers started to flex their compositional muscles, layering voices on top of one another in a kind of competing canon. Imagine for a moment the famous song, Row, Row, Row Your Boat, which is generally sung in a canon. So you would have one person start, the next person maybe start a bar later, the next person a bar later, and so on. Now imagine that compounded by 6, 7, even 8 or more people, all starting a bar off from the last person. Imagine not only the tune itself becoming incredibly complex, but imagine trying to follow the words as a listener. This is what happened with composers who enjoyed the challenge of creating these musical puzzles. The rise of polyphony really marks the first portion of the Baroque musical era. Musicians borrow the term Baroque from architecture, and it refers to a highly adorned style of architecture, in this case making reference to the complexity of polyphony. In general, during the Renaissance, music was tied either to the church or to the court, with an emphasis on larger human principles. The period known as the Age of Enlightenment spans from roughly the beginning of the 18th century through the beginning of the 19th century. Many historians use the end of the Napoleonic Wars as a kind of marker for the close of this period. The Age of Enlightenment saw the complete centralization of political power in Europe, in particular England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and the emergence of Russia as a major player on the scene. During that period, we see the continued hybridization of language and customs and the continued intermarriage among courts. The Age of Enlightenment is known for its celebration of reason, a kind of fusion of a modern European identity with the principles of ancient Greece and Rome. It's also worthy of note that during the Age of Enlightenment, the Baroque musical era came to a close with the deaths of Bach and Handel, who were, for their time, quite old-fashioned. They still preferred the complex polyphony of the prior period, whereas there was an emerging preference at this time for simplicity in music as a kind of counterweight to what was perceived as the overwrought complexity of the High Baroque. Music was tied intrinsically to either the church or to the court, with an emphasis on the classical principles of balance and structure, simplicity and beauty. Next, we come to the Romantic Age, which spans roughly from the beginning of the 19th century through the end of the 19th century. During the Romantic Age, we see the breakdown of monarchy, particularly in France. The French Revolution led to a complete shift of power in France to that of a republic from a monarchy. France and Germany became havens for Romantic artists who emphasized the individual and a sense of communion with God through the conduit of nature. This was the age of Romantic poets: Wordsworth, Goethe, Heine, Byron, Blake, Hugo, Pushkin, Verlaine, many, many others. The music of this time was highly individualized, quite secular, and often tied to literature. In fact, it was this tie to literature that inspired a great debate in the music world between so-called program music and universal music. Program music is music that is tied to an image or to a story. Universal music would be music that eschews those definitions. Composers like Liszt and Wagner epitomized the program music composer. They believed strongly that that tie with a story or an image helps the listener to form a sense of what the music is about. But those on the other side of the debate felt that that limited the imagination of the listener, that it restrained the listener too much and confined the listener to a particular mode of thinking. Composers who epitomized the so-called universal music argument would be Brahms, Bruckner, Mahler. The modern era spans roughly the end of the 19th century to about 1965. During the modern era, we see the rise of industrialized superpowers such as the United States of America, Great Britain, and others. It was an age of great political upheaval with changes of systems, including collectivism, communism, totalitarianism, and the modern era witnessed the violence of 2 world wars. Technology, communications, and the sciences became increasingly mechanized as a result of this zenith of the Industrial Revolution. Musically speaking, the modern era represents a culture of experimentation. Composers felt that the Romantics had literally squeezed the last drops out of tonality, and that it was time to create entirely new systems of composition. Often these new systems of music involved more dissonant sounds, and there was also a rebirth of structuralism through a movement called neo-classicism, of which Igor Stravinsky would be one proponent. Music could express the dismantling of tonality, yes, but also in some cases a conscious rejection of beauty as a principle. For others, music could represent political rebellion, bringing to mind such composers as Shostakovich and Prokofiev, who could use their music as a way to express their disagreement with what was happening in the world around them. And thus we arrive at the contemporary era. Clearly, this is an age of globalization, a digital age, in which the computer interconnects society in ways that previous societies could not even have imagined. Our era saw the civil rights movement come into fruition, the rise of political activism, social media, and a second and third year post-war generation who place great emphasis on individual liberties. Musically speaking, the contemporary era represents a widely varied culture, with movements reborn to counter those of the modern era, including minimalism and the rebirth of tonality through neo-romanticism. Now, anything goes. Music could be written in an older romantic tonal style. It can be thorny and dissonant, serial, whatever. The fact that this is an age of immediate transmission of cultural exchanges through technology means that we simply don't know what the future will bring. As I stated earlier, I strongly dislike taking a reductionist view of the arc of history and boiling everything down to black or white. That being said, the terms classical and romantic do have clear roots in principles that share similarities but also enjoy differences. And I think it's interesting to see how these differences oscillate from the Middle Ages through the present. An interesting question is, where do we go from here? For fun, I've prepared a Venn diagram in which I've placed some of the big composers along a spectrum from classical to romantic as I see them, with the classically leaning composers on the left, marked in gray, and the romantically leaning composers on the right, marked in gold. The advantage of the Venn diagram, of course, is the overlapping area in the middle, in which I've placed Bach, Handel, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, and Debussy. This chart is, of course, highly subjective, and you may have your opinions of where certain people should fit. I think the point is less, is Adam Neiman right about it, and more about getting your own wheels turning to think about these things in a deep way, to ask yourself, where on this spectrum do you believe these composers could belong? Now that we've surveyed the oscillations of the principles of classical and romantic across history, let's take a look at some performance terminology. Often you hear the use of these words in discussions of music, and I'd like us to have a clearer understanding of what they mean. Articulations. Articulation literally means the length of a note. So, for example, if a note is extremely short, we call it staccato. If a note is connected to another note, we call it legato. And there is an almost infinite variety of lengths that can take place in between extremely short and totally connected. These articulations change the way we feel about the music. They change the way that the music is punctuated as a sentence. Dynamics. Dynamics refers to the volume at a given point in the music. Music rises and falls in its volume. This rise and fall creates contrast between the highest and the lowest points, and it creates a sense of power mounting or receding. Composers use dynamics for expressive purposes all the time. Sometimes they imply dynamics, at others they indicate them in the score. A famous example of this would be Ludwig van Beethoven, who very often wrote these sforzando marks. Sforzando means suddenly loud, but then immediately follows his sforzandos or loud markings with piano, very soft markings, to create maximal contrast. This is an effect that he used to great effect to create a sense of drama and urgency. phrasing. Phrasing in music is very similar to phrasing in speech. It's how your sentence flows. Does it flow hesitantly? Does it flow quickly? Does it ebb and flow? Is it very rhythmic and stable? Where are the beginnings and the ends of the sentences? Where are the beginnings and the endings of the paragraphs? All of those principles that we think of in language correlate to music, and composers have ways of indicating phrasing. They might do so through the use of lines that tell us what parts of the phrase are connected to other parts of the phrase. They may do so with literal commas inserted into the score to tell us to take a breath. Or they may imply it through other means that we as interpreters learn to read for ourselves in order to make good phrasing decisions. Timing. Timing and phrasing are of course interrelated, but timing specifically refers to speed and its changes. We use a word in music called rubato. Rubato comes from the Italian verb rubare, which means to steal. Time in music is literally stolen or given back. Or else, time proceeds in an exactly measured fashion. Rarely, though, do we play in a completely measured, even fashion. And I will demonstrate some of this in the Mozart and Schumann pieces momentarily. Timing is one of the elements that gives a performer an incredible range of individuality. Think about the way that you time your speech. If you had to say the same thing 3 times, would you say it 3 times identically? Would you emphasize more as you went along and space things out? Would you speed it up to create a sense of agitation? Would you linger over a certain syllable in a word to create emphasis? The timing relates not only to the phrasing, but to the dynamics and to the articulations. And together, these make some of the most important elements of music. A discussion of performance terminology would be incomplete, however, if we didn't discuss some of the effects which are native to certain instruments, therefore idiomatic. For example, pedaling is a piano-specific concern. Well, in reality, organs also have pedals, so do harps, but they function a little bit differently from how a pedal functions on a piano. So for our purposes, we're going to discuss piano pedaling. The pedal is literally a mechanism that raises the dampers on the piano to allow all the strings to resonate at once. Normally, when you push a key down, the damper, meaning the device that normally sits in contact with the string, keeping it silent, is raised, allowing that one note to resonate. When you push the pedal down, all the dampers on the piano rise at the same time. So any notes you play resonate with all the strings of the piano, creating an incredibly resonant and kind of blurry effect. It has been said that pedaling breathes life into piano playing, and this is very true, although, like any tool, it must be used correctly and appropriately. Harmonics. A harmonic literally refers to the upper partial of a note. When you hear a note performed in space, you're not just hearing that note, but you're actually hearing an entire harmonic series. Every note resonates with its upper harmonics. On a string instrument, for example, if you lightly touch the string at a very specific point on the fingerboard, you'll actually hear a kind of whistling tone that's much higher than the principal note. That is a harmonic, and composers sometimes use this to create a very special, very magical sound. Now, specific to string playing are the effects of vibrato and slides. Vibrato is also something wind players can use, as well as brass players at times, but for our purposes, we'll talk about it relative to string playing. If you ever watch a string player, they don't just stick their left finger down against the fingerboard and then bow the note. Very often, they move their finger back and forth in an oscillating pattern that creates a vibration akin to the human voice. Think of an opera singer. Think of that beautiful resonant sound. Very rarely is the sound you hear from an opera singer, what we call a straight tone, a tone with no vibration. The vocal cords naturally vibrate back and forth, creating this vibrating effect, which is so human to our ears. And string players aim to imitate the voice through the use of vibrato. And slides. A slide is when a string player literally slides across the string. Rather than pushing the note down at the precise location of the note indicated by the composer, the performer can slide the finger a little bit in between those notes to create a glided effect, an elided effect. Again, this is something you hear singers do, and string players do it in imitation of the voice. Now that we have our toolkit of musical terminology, let's take a closer look at those two pieces that I played for you earlier, the Mozart Sonata and the Schumann Traümerei. I'm going to start by examining the Mozart. Here's a reminder of how it starts. This is a nice, symmetrical, balanced phrase structure. This phrase, or musical sentence, really has four parts to it, four gestures, as I would like to call them. The first gesture sounds like this. That gesture has a kind of growing shape as it falls down to the low note after the four-note scale, and then it lands a little harder here, and then it gets quieter. This falling interval is the musical gesture of sigh. Now, my shaping, my dynamic is very important. If I were to misshape the phrase, it might sound a little something like this. Kind of aggressive, because I started strongly. There's my nice phrase shape, weak to strong to weak. Now let's examine the second phrase element, the response. Well, what's different about that from the first gesture? Well, it's lacking that fast scale to it. Remember, the first gesture had this falling scale at its beginning. This second gesture really just kind of meanders. It goes up, back down to the same first note, and then back up, not quite as high, and then falls. It has a recessive feeling to it. It has a sense of plaintiveness, maybe questioning. Again, my dynamic is very important. If I were to misshape the phrase, I might get something like this. Or none of those are very attractive, right? So my nice shaping will shape to the fourth note of that sequence. There. Okay, so now putting these two phrases back to back, we can hear them relate to one another. We have our first phrase. We have our second phrase. Okay, so just store those in your mind for a moment, and now let's look at our third little phrase, the third gesture. It kind of reminds me of the first gesture, but it's a little bit fancier. The first gesture only had 4 notes to the fast scale. This has 6. Instead of just that, which would be almost identical to the first gesture, he adds 2 notes at the beginning that give it a little bit more embellishment. It's like wearing a little bit of jewelry, but not too much, just the right amount. But clearly, it is more similar to the first gesture than it is to the second gesture. Again, my shaping makes a big difference, right? I'm shaping to the lowest note after the scale, here, and then falling weaker here to create that musical sigh. Now let's look at our fourth gesture. Very similar to our second gesture. It has the feeling of response. It doesn't have the fancy scale to it. the activity, it's a little calmer. This time it actually goes up. And then it lands on a side. So let's put these 4 gestures side by side as written so you can hear them. First gesture, second gesture, third gesture, fourth gesture. Now I talked to you about the dynamics of each gesture individually. Now they have to relate to one another in space, kind of like making a sentence out of words. So if, for example, I make all of them of equal volume, I get something that sounds kind of uniform, like this. All the notes are correct. I played in the right rhythms. I didn't miss anything. But I don't hear gestures. I must shape the phrase. I must punctuate and articulate the shaping of the phrase in such a way that I create those micro shapes. Now, how does Mozart take this melody and embody it with a sense of harmony? Well, he does so with the left-hand accompaniment. He had many options for how to accompany this tune. He could have done something very simple like this. But just having 4 chords in the left hand feels maybe a little bit edgy. It doesn't have fluidity to it. So by creating this spaced out accompaniment, taking that chord, for example, and kind of winding it back and forth. Same thing here, instead of just a chord, kind of turning it about. He fills in the gaps in between where those chords would be is now a fluid line, kind of like water flowing. And so the result is something that feels very fluid. Okay. Let's talk about timing a little bit. If I were to play that phrase with a romantic timing, now when I say a romantic timing, I'm getting a little ahead of myself because we're going to focus on Schumann in a little while and talk about that. But a romantic timing might sound something a little bit like this. So I did several things there. Firstly, I unshackled the phrasing from the meter a little bit. If you tried to count that, it would have been very difficult because, yes, my beats were there, but they got stretched and pulled back and forth. My hands were not always together. This was a romantic device that I used. I lingered over certain notes just, well, because I felt like it. Yeah? That's the romantic spirit, that I am talking from the first person point of view, rather than this being an objective conversation between 2 parties that clearly have some kind of call and response. So as a classical interpreter of the work, I'm going to take a slightly more reserved attitude about how I play it. I'm not going to impose that kind of personality, in a way, on the performance. Instead, I'm going to allow it to flow without my interference, and therefore the conversation comes out in full form. So I'm going to play those back to back. I'm going to play a highly romanticized, overwrought version, and then I'm going to play what I would think of as a more classical version of the phrase. I'm sure you can hear the difference. It's obviously a matter of taste and it's a matter of principles. But the things that we're talking about make this piece classical in the sense that we've been talking about. Let's continue on our journey through the Mozart. Our next phrase gesture sounds very similar to our second gesture. If you remember the second gesture, it had 6 fast notes and then 2 slower ones. Well, Mozart does something similar. We have 6 fast ones again, and then 2 slow-ish ones. So here's our slower ones. It's not quite as slow as phrase 2's ending was. This one's a little faster. And then we have those 6 fast notes. But our 6 fast notes are not moving in the same direction. First he goes up, then he falls, and repeats. He could have done that and gone directly to that note, but instead he decides to repeat the last note to make that repeat. Whenever we repeat something, just like in speech patterns, we are emphasizing. Yeah, I don't repeat myself. I don't repeat myself unless I mean to. Yeah? That's on purpose. He wants me to emphasize that repeated note. So then what happens? We have this little gesture. Then he does it again with a little pickup. Ba-ba-dum. That feels very insistent, right? Da-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-dum. Da-dee-dum. Try this at home. Speak it out to yourself. Da-da-dee-da-da-da-dee-dum. Ba-bee-dum. Da-da-dee-da-dee-da-da-dum. Ba-bee-dum. If you say it that way, it starts to feel like there could be words to it, right? Da-da-dee-da-da-da-dee-dum. Ba-bee-dum. Yeah? There's an insistence, there's an emphasis caused by that bit of articulation. So remember I talked about articulation having to do with the length of the note. I didn't connect. No. I made the first note short. Then I connected. Now I didn't invent that choice. That choice is in the score. Mozart gives me a line, a slur between these notes, telling me he wants them fused, he wants them connected. But that pickup note he leaves without any mark on it, which is his indication that it should be separate from the others. How short is up to me. It could be longer, gentler, if it's longer. Could be really short. That's where my interpretation comes to bear. My taste, my sense of classical proportion. A lot of that's going to depend on how fast I play the piece, what mood I'm in, what kind of piano I'm working with, what kind of short articulation is going to work best for that particular moment on that particular day. So again, putting these phrases together, we have our 5th phrase, then this insistent response. Then what? Then we have this. Wow, that's really long and elaborate. That is like, a piece of jewelry. Because what could he have done? He could have kept things very simple. He could have ended that way, kept everything just very tidy, organized, minimal. Instead of just waiting here and resuming, he fills in these gaps with more searching, more ornamentation. And he doesn't just go in one direction. It's not like he just goes. He goes in different directions to give it a feeling of wandering. So that already twists and turns. Goes up, gets stuck here, falls. There's a lot of complexity to that, but it's very subtle. And that's his way of filling in the gap between these moments. So we have this resolution, fill in the gap. And then he wants to repeat that bar that we just heard, but not exactly. He could have done the exact replica, but he decides to be a little bit more emphatic, more emotional about it. tira, 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 please, 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 Adam, 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 Adam. These are what we call couplets, and a couplet is a kind of musical gesture that indicates sighing, just like that falling note at the beginning was. He now just puts a bunch of these falling notes in a row to create a new gesture. How do I know that? Because he gives me little lines that pair the notes off. So I know Mozart is thinking about these in little pairs. So we have our fifth phrase, insistent, fancy phrase, insistent sighing phrase. He could have done the same ornament, but he gets stuck in a loop. So this time he gets out by going up exuberantly. Right? Going all the way up to the high point of the keyboard to create this feeling of joy. Let me show you what it could sound like if he didn't do that. If he stayed sort of local to where he was. It doesn't really convey much thrust or joy or energy. Certainly not as much as this rising scale. And then he falls. Even this gesture, if I were to just take the top note, so I'm playing two notes at once here. If I were to just take the top note, play it faster, doesn't that sound a little like our first gesture? All he's done is he's taken that first gesture and he slowed it down for us a little bit and created a different articulation. They're now short to close things out, giving it a kind of laughing quality, a joyous, joking quality. So now I'm going to put all that together for you so you can hear the gestures add up to a musical sentence. And there we have our first musical sentence in the piece. Now, when you first hear this, it comes off as, I would say, inevitable. Mozart has this talent for making things sound so natural, as if they always were that way. Well, that's his gift. Because as you can see, each gesture was well thought out. Each gesture was thought out individually, in relation to another gesture, in relation to a series of gestures, and in relation to a much larger series of gestures. All of this adds up to musical phrasing. We talked about how we articulate the notes to give different kind of punctuation to them. We talked about the dynamics, how we have to shape the phrase according to the phrase structure so that it feels natural to emphasize and put the right syllable instead of the wrong syllable on the word, right? We talked about timing and how it's very important for my phrasing that the timing not be too manipulated, and I demonstrated what happens if I get really free with the timing. In that over-romanticized example, I also did something I didn't tell you about, which was I used too much pedal. The pedal, as we discussed, lifts the dampers of the piano. If you look here, when I press the pedal down, all the dampers go up. So now, all those strings can resonate. So if I play a single note without pressing the pedal, just that damper rises to allow the string that I've touched to keep vibrating without stop. As soon as I let go of the key, the damper falls, stops the string. When I press that pedal down, all the dampers go up. And so now any note I play will continue to resonate in a blurry, swampy mix, right? The pedal itself is an incredibly powerful tool. And the pedal did exist in its most primitive forms in Mozart's time. In fact, I was privileged to get to play on a few of Mozart's pianos when I was in Salzburg, and I had the opportunity to try the different pedal mechanisms that he was experimenting with. So what if I overuse the pedal the way I would in a romantic piece? You might get something that sounds really messy like this. Right? Or even if I don't overuse it to that extent, but overuse it slightly. Something that sort of resembles the piece but lacks its classical principles. So it's very important that I understand as a performer what those classical principles are in terms of the music making process, the balance, the lack of adornment, the allowance of the music to simply pour forth in the conversation as Mozart indicated in the score without too much interference, either through effect like the pedal, misshaping it, over manipulating or stretching time to the wrong degree, creating too much dynamic contrast. What if I overdid my shaping? We talked about how it's important that I shape the phrase the right way. What if I shape it the right way but to the wrong degree? You get the picture. The classical performance, classical music style is really all about that proportion. When you're listening to a performance of a classical piece, you, as the jury, in a way, should be listening to how the performer presents the classical style. Does the performer understand the principles of balance, equity, beauty, simplicity? Is the performer even thinking about those things? Is the performer indulging in a moment that doesn't seem to make sense to you as the listener? You have the right to react to those things very naturally and very organically. Now let's shift our discussion to the Schumann work. We're going to discuss the romantic spirit, the romantic style. Now this work, Traümerei, literally has to do with a dream. Already that tells me a lot about the piece, the fact that it's titled Dream. One would almost never see a piece with a kind of character title, a programmatic title to it, like a dream in the age of the Enlightenment. This is really a romantic idea. Let me remind you how this piece goes. This is how the piece starts, right? It's very gentle, it's very quiet. Now we examined Mozart's microphrase structure, right? There are a lot of little gestures to it. Are there gestures here too? Yes, there are. So let's first look at the gestures, then we're going to look at how the gestures connect, and we're going to explore how they connect differently from how the Mozart gestures connected to one another. So our first gesture is the very first note connecting to the second note, this. The melody of it is just the upper two notes. That's our first gesture, very simple. It's like dipping a toe in the water, right? What happens after that? This gesture. It traveled quite a distance. So the first note was down here, and it traveled a full octave in the span of literally one breath. Very quick rise across range. All in a stream of notes. So we had two very slow notes to comprise the first gesture. And then a series of quicker notes going up very high for the second gesture. Then what happens? This is our third gesture. Again, I'll play that third gesture for you. So it falls first and rises at the end. Do you remember the Mozart sigh? Here we have a similar sigh, but across a larger interval. In the Mozart, the two notes were very close. In the Schumann, they're quite far. How do I know that this note is stronger than this note? How do I know it's not? I know because Schumann placed this note on the downbeat of the bar, on beat 1. How do I know it's beat 1? Because he tells me where the beats are in the score. The fact that that note falls on beat 1 tells me it's the strong beat of the bar, because I know this as a musician who's trained in the language of music, and I know that that F, that upper note, is the response to the stronger note. So I guess I get this shape for my third gesture. Immediately followed by my fourth gesture, very similar in shape to that third gesture. Here's my fifth gesture. Sixth gesture is the resolution. Resolution. So I have a series of gestures. Gesture 1. Gesture 2. Gesture 3. Gesture 4. Gesture 5. Gesture 6. Notice that gestures 3, 4, 5, and 6 all have a sense of recession to them. They start up here, fall down a little bit, fall down a little bit, close. So what does that sound like together with the accompaniment? So there are several things about the accompaniment and some of the counter lines that are very important to note in this romantic style. A romantic composer does not hesitate to thicken the sauce when the composer wants to. I say thicken the sauce because I have a single note here, I have a single note in the bass that now accompanies, and now I have 4 notes at the same time. Then I go through my second gesture in the upper voice. Now, along with this note, I have a bass, I have a fifth above it, I have an exactly 1 octave below the top, and then I have a counter line that comes in, and then these move together like 2 people having a conversation at the same time, and he adds a bass. So it started off very bare, just a single note by itself in space, 2 notes in space. Now a total of 6 notes holding together. He moves up, 5 notes together with a counter tune in my left hand. Here now I have 2 counter tunes. So I have my top tune, actually 3 counter tunes. I have my top tune here, bass. I have the tenor. I have my alto. And then I have one more alto just holding a note. So I have all these moving in tandem. So my sauce just got very thick. Yeah? So again, let's hear that all together. Go to the same spot here, but he changes the key. He goes and he reaches higher for this one, like he's pleading with the heavens to cooperate with his wishes. Alright, now it takes a long time falling back down. So that's gesture. With harmonic complexity. It feels a little bit dark. It's minor, major. He puts dark and light right next to each other. Dark, light. That's what we call diminished. That has uncertainty, agitation, urgency, followed by major. That's a lot of complexity, harmonically speaking, right? So we have our second phrase, very similar to the first at the beginning. Now he's going to reach higher than he did the first time. And now there's passion to it because it reaches a moment of maybe pain and darkness a little bit. But it resolves. Comes back to where we started. He's describing a dream, right? So perhaps this dream has moments of nostalgia, moments of pain, moments of fear, but also moments of tremendous repose and tranquility. Let's talk about some of the elements that we did talk about in the Mozart, but in this context. Articulation. There wasn't a single short note in there. Everything was very connected. Now that's not a rule of romantic music by any means. Romantic music can certainly have short notes. But the phrases are very connected together here, right? I don't have any lifts. It would have made it feel like a dance. It would almost make it feel like I should do something like that. Totally different feeling from this. If I were unfamiliar with this piece, but I knew what I know about romantic style, and I heard just this, I would know that it is a romantic piece of music, because a classical composer would very rarely connect in a smooth elision between these four intervals apart from each other at the beginning of a piece with an upbeat and a downbeat. It's just very rare in the classical period. This tells me it's romantic. And that chord right there, filling in the gaps with such thickness and warmth, is also a part of the romantic sentiment. The size of the gesture, he doesn't keep it down here. What else could he have done? Maybe something like this. He could have kept everything very self-contained, but he really opens the range to the higher register immediately. Then the counterline. 3 counterlines at the same time. Falling. rise up higher this time with some urgency, some darkness, light, anxiety, and relief, all in close proximity to one another. What about meter? What about shape? What about timing? Well, let's look at shape. Let me misshape it for you and see how it sounds to you. Exaggerated shapes, right? I have to put my strong and my weak beats where they belong. So that's similar to the Mozart. That's just a universal quality of language, really. Now let's talk about dynamic. Even if I shape the phrase in the right way, if I overdo the phrase or I underdo the phrase, it affects it differently. What if I underdo the phrase here? Underdo the shape. I don't get the sense of where the line is actually going. It's still pretty and it's atmospheric, but lacking again that sense of clear direction. Now, Mozart had a call and response, right? He had his strong phrase, he had his weaker phrase. He had his stronger phrase, he had his weaker phrase. Do we have the same patterning of our phrases? Well, let's check. We have a kind of weak phrase, and we have a strong phrase, right? Now we should have a weak phrase if we're going to follow the pattern. Now we should have a strong phrase according to the pattern, then a weak phrase, then strong. But that feels artificial in this context. Why? Because of the interconnectedness of the phrases to one another. I think, and this is a very typical sign of the Romantic style, that there isn't a necessarily metered or patterned phrase structure, but the phrases can follow a whim, an emotion. I can start calmly, I can have a gust of energy, and now I can spend a whole lot of time falling down gradually. And I got back down. So the fact that both the Mozart and the Schumann have phrase structures, again, that's just a universal aspect of any language. But the fact that the Mozart has a patterned phrase structure, a discernible pattern, whereas my Schumann follows more the whim of an emotion, is very much in keeping with the classical versus Romantic principles. What about timing? In Romantic playing, Romantic style of playing, we use more manipulation of time. I'm going to play this for you in a very square manner, the way I played the Mozart, without manipulating my phrases, but playing really according to the lengths of time Schumann indicates in his score. played all the right notes. I played all the right rhythms as marked. I even did the shaping pretty nicely, but I did nothing with my timing. As a result, it was utterly square. I don't think it really communicated to you a sense of urgency in the moments that were urgent, a sense of tranquility in those that then responded to the urgency with tranquility. I didn't really create an emotional response in you. You might have said that that was pretty enough, but pretty, well, cotton is pretty, but it doesn't necessarily have features to it, right? For this to really work as a romantic spirited work, I need to give it those features. I need to give it that sense of emotional urgency or tranquility in the varying degrees called for by the score. So now, let me describe the rubato that I would use. The rubato, meaning rubare, to steal, right? I'm going to steal and take time according to the music. I'm going to start by placing my first downbeat with a little bit of weight. It's like I'm going to lift a really heavy rock. I'm going to lift it and I'm going to drop it back down so that it has impact. That means that I'm not just going to go, It's not going to just be so easy for me. I'm going to struggle to lift it and release it. Lift, release. Lift, release. Now I'm going to direct the energy forward to my high notes so that this flows as an emotional gesture. I played those much faster than they're valued on the page. They're valued as so. But I made them move a lot faster than that. But I didn't just move at a uniformly fast rate. I didn't play like this. Because that's just wrong rhythm. Now I've manipulated the time value so far away from the original that it's just distorted, right? Well, what I did was I started the gesture kind of exactly in time and then let it roll forward, kind of like coaxing a rock over a hill, and maybe at first it rolls a little slowly as it crests and then it finally gains some momentum. So I'm going to do the same thing. It's going to start with a little bit of hesitancy and I'm going to move, right? And then I'm going to show you my micro phrases by taking little pauses. Pause. Maybe I slow down to get here. Rather than just going exactly in time, I'm going to take my time down to create a sense of suspense for you. Where is he going? He's going here. And now I'm going to play with more urgency as he goes higher. And keep the urgency while the music is dark, right? It's in the minor key. Urgently. And that fact that the dark and the light are right next to each other, dark, light. I'm waiting a little bit on my dark notes so that I feel like the dagger in my heart for that moment, but then I feel the relief when I take it out. Dagger in my heart, release. And relax. And so when I put all that together, I get this. can feel that put together in the right proportions, and in this case the proportions are bigger than those of Mozart, by expanding my dynamic range, expanding the pliability of my timing, shaping the phrases according to their natural syllables, being dictated by the emotion of the moment rather than the note values as they're marked in the score, I can give this the sense of dreaming, I can give this the sense of meaning, the sense of urgency at the right moments, and the sense of calm and repose at the other moments. This is the art of interpretation, of course, and I'm letting you have a glimpse of the kind of thought processes that every professional musician grapples with. When we grapple with these concepts of classical and romantic, we're not just grappling with abstract concepts, we're really talking about certain proportions, certain ways of thinking. Ultimately, I feel, if I had to boil this all down, this whole discussion of classical and romantic, which, as I told you, I don't really agree with from a fundamental perspective, because human beings are human beings and we are complex, layered creatures. Things are not as simple as black and white, but if I did have to distill them, my classical side of the spectrum is going to deal a lot with proportion in the third person. My romantic side is going to deal with emotion in the first person. Like a novel, like a book. A book can be written from the point of view of I. I feel this. I went there. I wanted that. I wish for this. The book that's written in the third person presents events or people over here. The author remains a little bit more removed from the situation. So that objectivity versus that subjectivity. The sense of being governed here or being governed here. The sense of the kinds of proportion. All these lead me to understand what the classical and the romantic styles are in terms of music making. I've had a great time talking to you today about classical and romantic. These are not easy things to talk about, and very often we mean slightly different things when we use the terms classical and romantic. Nevertheless, through our survey of history, through our deep dive into the music of Mozart and Schumann, I hope that you feel that you've gained a stronger foothold in understanding these important concepts, and I hope that your listening experiences in your future will be greatly enhanced. Thanks for being a part of today's broadcast of the Get to Know the Music series. See you next time.